the review and recap series for the Making of America 1789 to 1900. We're going to have a look today at the second theme within Making of America, which is the West 1839 to 1860. I've broken this section down into two different sections. The first one that we're going to have a look at today looks at the culture of the Native Americans and also has a look at migration west. We're going to start off by making sure that everybody knows what the plains actually are or where the plains are. So if you have a look on the screen, you'll see that there's an area of the map which is highlighted in a pinky colour. This is the area that was known as the plains. So it's the area between the Rocky Mountains and the Mississippi River, and it is the area where Indians had been pushed into following the Indian Removal Act of 1830. Now, we looked at this in the last session. Remember, it was Andrew Jackson that passed this act, and the aim was to move all of the Indians west of the Mississippi River so that the white Americans could dominate the area east of that. The main tribe that you will need to know about is the Lakota Sioux. So we're going to have a look at three different plains tribes and some of the cultural similarities and differences between them. But the main tribe that you need to know about for the exam on the plains is the Lakota Sioux. So the culture of the Plains Indians then. First of all, the Lakota Sioux, who I've just spoken about. The first thing to note about them is that they are nomadic. Now, nomadic literally means wandering, so they do not have a set location. They move around following the buffalo, and they set up base wherever they see fit, so they don't have a set home. The buffalo are very, very important to them. As I've said, they follow them round, hence the fact that they are nomadic, but they also have multiple uses for the buffalo. I've given you three that you can see on the slide, but you may have done more in class. Of course, you can use those instead. I would suggest that you know at least three for the exam. It's also quite an easy thing to remember, so please don't waste your time in revision revising every single use of the buffalo. As long as you've got a couple to use in the exam, that's absolutely fine. So the ones that I've given you are they use them for food, they use them to make shelter, for example, the hide, which is used to create the teepee, which you've got as the third bullet point, which is a tent-like structure that they live in, and you've also there got that they use the stomach for a cooking pot. They are very spiritual as a tribe. They believe in the great spirit of Wakantanka, and they also believe that the Black Hills of Dakota are a very spiritual place. This is where their ancestors, they believe the spirits are there, so very, very important place to them. They're hostile to white Americans, so they don't like them. Obviously, there is a history for this with the Indian Removal Act, so this is why they don't like them. And it also indicates why they set up warrior societies. These warrior societies trained their men to fight on horseback with bows and with guns. We then have the Cheyenne. There are some similarities between them and the Sioux, so let's have a look at those. They are partially nomadic, so they do have more set bases than the Lakota Sioux, but they also move around. They eat buffalo, but they use the buffalo a lot less than the Lakota Sioux do. They also live in teepees, so remember those tent-like structures. They are also spiritual, so they believe in God, basically. They are slightly different because they aren't as hostile to the white Americans because they trade with them. So they see them as important for their survival. So they're not as hostile to the white Americans as the Lakota Sioux are. But they obviously expected some fighting because they also have warrior societies. The third group that we have, or the third tribe that we have, are the Nez Perce. So they are not nomadic. They have fixed villages. So they are not wandering. They are in one location. They do hunt buffalo, but only in the summer. So they are not as reliant on the buffalo as the Cheyenne, or definitely not as the Lakota Sioux. So they have a different diet in winter. They have huts in winter as well and teepees in the summer, so again that is a difference. They fought on horses, but only during summer hunts, so again slightly different. Their warrior societies are less significant, or we can tell this because, as you can see, as the bottom bullet point says, they were friendly with the white Americans, so it's less important for them to have as strong fighters as the other two groups, who are perhaps a little bit more hostile. They are also spiritual as well. So we can definitely see some of the similarities between the three. But as I said, the most important group that you need to know in terms of the plain Indians for the exam are the Lakota Sioux. Okay, we're then going to move on to why Americans migrated west. Now, to be a migrant means to move from one place of the country to another. So these will be Americans that are moving from the east and they are starting to move west. Now, remember, a lot of the natives have already been moved west into that area called the Plains, and what we are going to see is that now white Americans start moving into those areas as well. So the natives have already been pushed out of their original areas, they've made a home in the Plains, and now the white Americans start to come into those areas as well. And we're going to see why this happened. Firstly then, there is a reason which caused many people to just look for a new opportunity, and that is that in 1837 the banks collapsed in the east. So many people lost their savings, wages were cut, they lost their jobs, and they just felt that they had nothing to lose. So let's go west, let's see whether we can set up a new life for ourselves in the Plains, let's see if we can set up our own farm, for example. So the banks collapsing was the catalyst for many to start to move west. We then have the idea that the climate was better in the west. This again would help with farming. So early explorers such as Lewis and Clark, who we looked at in the first session, had spread rumours that the climate was better in the west. So you could be a more successful farmer in the west, you could have your own land, and you could create a successful farm. So that was another reason why people began to move. We then have something called the Preemption Act, which was in 1841. Now, this is a bit more specific than the other two, so just have a look at this information carefully and try and get your head around it. So the Preemption Act was passed in Oregon, and a farmer who built a house and cleared the trees around that house would be given the first opportunity to buy the surrounding land. So if you decide that you're going to stay on that land and you sort the area out, basically, you can buy the land surrounding that house. This stops land speculators buying up all these land. Remember the land speculators we spoke about in the first session? They were given land or bought land in 640 acre chunks. They often broke that up and then sold it sold it with high prices to yeoman farmers, smaller farmers. So the Preemption Act allows those smaller farmers to get the land for a much fairer price rather than buying it from land speculators. So this encourages small farmers to move west so that they don't have to pay those high prices from the land speculators. We then have something that we'll mention as we go through the course, which is manifest destiny. This was a belief that God wanted white Americans to expand west. So some Christians believed it was their mission to convert Indians to Christianity, and they believe that expanding west is God's vision for the Americans. So this is something that they must do. So manifest destiny, an important ideological reason for moving west. We then have, by 1840, mountain men and explorers. So the explorers we spoke about, Lewis and Clark, for example, had mapped routes which would make any journey west a lot safer. So journeys west used to be seen as something that was scary, people didn't know the best way to go, but these mountain men and explorers had made maps which encouraged people to migrate because they could make the journey safely. Now, in purple at the top of this slide, you will see some of the challenges that took place on the journey. So it wasn't something that you did without thought. It was a difficult journey, regardless of the maps. It took around 8 months. You could face extreme weather, so extreme cold, extreme heat. You could have stampeding buffalo and aggressive natives, especially the Lakota Sioux, for example, who we said were quite hostile. You had to trek over the Rocky Mountains. You had all of your belongings with you, which was obviously a difficult physical task. You also had diseases such as cholera, so people getting ill, potentially dying on the journey. And we also had, if you chose to go to California, you had to trek across deserts and the mountains of Sierra Nevada. And if you chose to go to Oregon, you had the Blue Mountains to cross. So it wasn't an easy thing to do, but the reasons that we've spoken about, the banks collapsing, the climate, the Preemption Act, manifest destiny, and mapped routes, did encourage people to migrate west. Okay, we're then going to have a look at what the impact of migration was on the plains. So when all these people moved, what impact did that have? Firstly, migration west meant many white migrants cutting through the hunting grounds of the plains tribes, such as the Lakota Sioux. So this is going to be a massive problem, particularly in regards to disturbing the buffalo. So the Lakota Sioux, remember, relied on the buffalo massively. They were nomadic, so they used to follow the buffalo around, and these paths that the migrants were making cut directly through the hunting grounds of the Plains tribes. They disturbed the buffalo, and this is going to cause a lot of conflict because tribes were having to cross each other's land due to reduced space, and they were coming into direct contact with white migrants. Treaties had to be signed as well. So when the white Americans did migrate west, they had to sign treaties if they were going to take some of the land. So, for example, in 1851, there was the Fort Laramie Treaty. This was where tribes such as the Sioux granted the USA rights to establish forts and safe routes along the plains in return for compensation. So, at this point, the government were trying to make treaties that were agreeable to the Plains Indians in the hope that there wouldn't be as much violence and fighting between white Americans and natives. We then had smaller Plains tribes such as the Crow, who were angry with bigger Plains tribes such as the Sioux because the bigger tribes gained higher compensation from the government. So this was almost clever from the government. It wasn't just causing conflict between white Americans and natives, it was creating tension between natives and natives. Perhaps there was a thought there that they would get angry at each other and they would fight one another, which was basically getting rid of a problem for the white Americans. So there was competition between natives, smaller tribes and bigger tribes on the plains as well. We also have another treaty which was called the Yakima Treaty. Now, this is a very good example of how the government made promises and then actually don't follow through with those promises. So in 1855, the US government signed a treaty with the Yakima stating that the government could have plains land, but that settlement wouldn't happen for 2 years. So the Yakima do sign it, they agree, but they have 2 years grace, really, where they can sort themselves out, perhaps somewhere else to live. But within 12 days of this treaty being signed, settlers were arriving. So this is a clear sign that the treaties don't live up to expectation from the natives. The Yakima then began raiding white settlements because they were understandably angry, and the US Army were called in. By 1858, the Yakima had lost 90% of their land and 24 of their chiefs had been hanged or shot. So we can clearly see the US government make this treaty. They don't follow the promises that they've outlined, and actually they then use violence against the natives. So the impact of migration on the plains overwhelmingly for the natives then is very negative. The relationship between the US government and the natives and plains tribes with other tribes as well is all deteriorating, and it's all because of white migrants moving west onto Plains Indian land. Okay, the final thing then to do is to test yourself on this first section of the West, so the culture of the Plains Indians and the migration west and the impact of migration west. So I would suggest now that you pause the video, you answer the 6 questions that are here, and then you play it again when you want to go through the answers, and I will go through those with you. Okay, so the answers to these 6 questions then. So number 1, where are the plains and who are the main tribe who live there? Or certainly the main tribe that you need to know for the exam. So the plains is the area between the Rocky Mountains and the Mississippi River, and the main tribe that you need to know for the exam are the Lakota Sioux. Second one, give 3 uses of the buffalo. Again, there are lots of these. I'm just going to give the 3 that I'd put on the slide. So you can have food to make shelter, the hide, for example, for the teepees, and the stomach for the cooking pot. There are lots more. So you can check your notes from class to see whether what you've got down is applicable. Number 3, what does the word nomadic mean? So the word nomadic means that the tribe don't live in one place, so they wander and they follow the buffalo. And remember, we spoke about the Lakota Sioux being the plains tribe that are the most nomadic. Number 4, give 2 reasons why Americans migrated west. You can have any of these examples. I've given all of the ones that I've been through with you. So the banks collapsed in 1837. We've got the promise of a better climate for farming. The 1841 Preemption Act, which remember stopped land speculators buying up all the land and gave the smaller farmers in Oregon a better chance of purchasing their own land. Manifest Destiny, so God's belief that Americans should move west. And finally, Mountain Men's Maps, so explorers like Lewis and Clark had laid out trails for people to move west in a safer way. 3 challenges migrants faced on their journey west. There were loads, so I've given you the whole list again. So I'll just read off the top 3. Took around 8 months, extreme weather, stampeding buffalo, but you've got the whole list there to have a look through. This was not an easy journey. And finally, what was the Yakima Treaty of 1855 and why was it successful for the tribe? So again, I've got the whole lot of information here, but basically there is a treaty signed. They were promised that it would be 2 years before white settlers moved in, but they arrived within 12 days. Remember that the Yakima lost 90% of their land, and 24 of their chiefs had been hanged or shot, so they end up losing out massively despite the treaty that they had signed with the US government. Okay, so that's it for now. We'll pick up on the rest of the West 1839 to 1860 in my next video.